You've just said that you think that your consciousness can see into your cells and see the structure of DNA. That has got to be utter nonsense.
But I just love that representation. It's so insanely cool, this representation. So you see the sort of the primary mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So, and that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere.
Often described as genetic code, DNA is a molecule composed of two polynucleotide chains that intertwine to form a double helix. The double helix symbol can be seen in ancient Aboriginal Australian, Chinese, and Egyptian art. Peterson is convinced these ancient symbols are a representation of DNA. This would imply that people living in the year 3000 BC were somehow cognizant about the building blocks of life at the molecular level. DNA, for the record, was discovered in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick.
You once showed in a lecture a picture of snakes spiraling around each other, snakes' tails.
Yes.
And you said something like, I think it's positively, that is the representation of DNA.
Yes, let's leave that one, but I promise I will return to that.
Well, let's run out of time, because that seems to me to go to the heart of what may be a difference between us, this aesthetic. I mean, that idea that in some sense represents DNA seems to me to be complete nonsense.
Okay, I will absolutely address that.
You love symbols. I mean, you're obsessed with symbols.
Yes.
You're almost drunk on symbols. And
you could say that.
I think you've got to stop and say, what does it actually mean to say?
Absolutely.
And the snakes twining is one thing. There are others, but that would be a very good one to try to nail down.
This obsession with snake symbols might have something to do with Jung. We know that Peterson here worships the Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist, and Jung did have a lot to say about snakes. These quotes from Jung could provide clues on how Peterson might perceive not just snake symbols, but the world at large.
I think that under some conditions, vision can expand to the point where they can see down into the micro level. They can apprehend the micro level consciously.
You think that our consciousness can extend down to the micro level, to the level of...
I do.
The micro level of DNA. Okay, that has got to be utter nonsense. I'm sorry.
Well, like I said, I'm perfectly willing to admit forthrightly that is a highly speculative idea.
Well, it is speculative, but it's also got to be false.
Why? Well, this is something I did want to talk to you about.
Okay,
it does take us rather far down the rabbit hole, though, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think it may be fundamental to our difference.
Earlier in the conversation, Peterson had speculated that a person under the influence of drugs might be able to communicate with his cells.
In this visionary experience, I could feel my consciousness go down these levels of analysis. And I could see things that they appeared to me in my field of imagination. And I looked at them and I thought, that looks a lot like DNA.
But you're an educated man who already knows about DNA.
Yes. These people didn't know it was DNA.
Didn't know about it. That's what's so...
Oh, no, they didn't know.
It doesn't surprise me in the least that you could have a visionary experience and think you see your DNA in your own cells. That, of course, is highly plausible. What is not
because I already know about it.
Yes. What is not plausible is that somebody who does not know about it, an ancient Chinese sculptor, whatever it was, who working long before Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA,
could possibly apprehend
it. That just isn't
fair enough.
Also, I wouldn't wish to pin you down on what was a sort of throwaway speculation on the DNA, but it does seem to me that that's kind of representative of what I mean by being drunk on symbols. I have no problem with, my big problem is equating it with DNA. That's bullshit. However, what might be interesting would be a commonality between myths all around the world, and then anthropologists argue about whether this is because of cross-infection of ideas or whether there's something Jungian about the... and I think that's a genuinely interesting question. Of course, the coincidence of an image or a statue in this part of the world and that part of the world, you should think about how improbable it is that two people might have hit upon the same design. I mean, the idea
Right.
of a snake spiraling around each other, it's not that difficult to think of. It's not. It wouldn't be ridiculously improbable that two tribes on opposite sides of the world would independently come upon that.
Dawkins is trying to make the point that the image of coiling snakes is not an especially unique symbol and should not be interpreted as evidence of a hidden collective unconscious. He also makes a distinction between probable and improbable coincidences. It is unclear from Peterson's response whether he registers this key distinction. He does sound as if he is grasping at straws.
So I'm interested in the improbability of coincidence in this case. Now, if,
Yes.
say, people in Scandinavia and people in the Amazonian jungle had independently developed an alphabet, which was the same alphabet. Now, that would be impressive. I mean, that would be,
Right. Well,
my goodness.
yes. Well, but
that-
it's also equally impressive that separated people did develop alphabets.
Yeah, but not the same alphabet.
No, I know they didn't use, but there's a level at which it's the same, right? Because they are alphabetic, and they are the use of written forms to represent
Yes,
sounds.
well, that's
So-
a sensible thing to have, and
It
it's
is.
such a good idea that it wouldn't be improbable that two tribes would have the same idea.
That's true, but it gets complicated too. Well, it gets complicated in the context of this argument because
You characterize yourself as religious sometimes, and yet you don't seem to believe in a supernatural creator. I'm not really
people
sure whether
ask
you do
me
or not.
all the time.
I know they do.
Whether I believe in God, and I say, well, I act as though God exists.
Yes, but I
Right,
mean,
which is a reference to this model idea. by the way.
last night you seem to be. Let me come to the idea of truth. Where you seem to be saying that which is beneficial to humanity or to your reduce your anxiety or makes you feel good or reduces stress is true. And
No. It's more than that. When you're talking about truth, are you talking about the nature of ultimate reality, or are you talking about the relationship of your models to that reality?
I
Right?
don't know that I care too much about that because I mean, let me tell you something that is true.
Okay.
We are cousins of chimpanzees.
Yes.
That is objectively true. It's another thing that's true is that the Earth orbits the Sun.
Yes.
These are not. One can argue about the epistemology of that, but I want to be a realist about this and say that there may be kinds of truth which are somehow filtered through our Darwinian past and which influence the way we see truth, and we may be deceived by all sorts of things. We may be self-deceived, but there are objective truths. It is the business of science to find them, and science has tools for stripping off subjective bias, for stripping off self-deception.
Yes.
And that's why we do double-blind trials
Absolutely.
in medicine.
It's why
and
we
so on.
use random assignation to
Exactly,
group as
yes.
well.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Right. It's happened. But there's a problem here. It's a real problem. And this is the postmodern conundrum, I would say. It's useful and true to say that there are objective facts. But the problem is, there's an infinite number of them.
True.
Okay, so now the question is, as a scientist, how do you decide which facts to attend to? And the answer to that is, you cannot do that using the scientific process.
No, that's true.
So then the question is, how the hell do you derive a valid conclusion from that plethora of information? Because you could report all sorts of meaningless correlations, right? They would be spurious, but also practically useless. And there's just endless numbers of those in the data set. You know, how do you judiciously use a statistical process to extract out the information that is what? True? Yes, but it's not just true. You want it to be useful.
I agree. Yes.
Right. Okay. So that's where the pragmatism issue comes in, right? Because then we might say, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because I know you care deeply about truth, and I know that you're motivated by it. And so then I would say that's a metaphysical relationship in some sense. It's an a priori metaphysical relationship because you made a commitment to truth. And I would also say that that's an act of faith, because you might ask yourself, in science, is it truth or untruth that serves the world?
Peterson's definition of truth sounds a lot like data. Data is truthful, but for it to be meaningful, it needs to be interpreted pragmatically and used beneficially. Peterson argues that it is impossible to pursue truth independent of this beneficial component. This could explain why he might claim that truth must be useful and benefit others.
I don't believe that you can be a scientist and discover objective truth, say, in a useful manner, without being committed to a metaphysical vision of the redeeming power of the truth.
Well, that's where we came back. That's where we came in, because there are all sorts of truths which do not serve the world. There are all sorts of truths which are very unpleasant.
Yes.
An analogy might be, as a doctor, you have a patient who has incurable cancer, and you have to decide whether to tell that patient the truth or not. When you're arguing with your colleagues whether to tell this patient the truth, you could very well argue, shall we tell him or shall we not? It would be beneficial not to or beneficial to. But everybody should agree that it is true that this man has cancer. That is true.
Yes, yes. Well, this is partly why this issue is so unbelievably complicated, because what you just said is true. But it's also the case that you have to apply an ethical framework onto that infinity of truths in order to focus on and communicate those. See, you've picked topics that you communicate to people, and there are other topics you didn't pick.
Yes.
And there's most of the other topics you didn't pick. And so the question to me is, and this is partly why I got interested in Jung, by the way, because he was very interested in the unconscious direction of attention. The psychoanalysts were fascinated by that. That's partly why they were interested in Freudian slips. But one thing we could ask, do you think that you picked your field of study, or did it pick you?
I'm not sure, but I don't think that's not relevant. It doesn't.
It has to be relevant, because it's actually the question of relevance.
It seems to me you keep wandering from one subject to another without sticking to one at a time. I mean, we went to kenosis, and I kind of wondered what that had got to do with anything, and then
it's probably some difference in our thinking style. You know, I think. Well, and so
we're rattling around again. The mere fact that there's a very large number of things you could attend to, and you have to choose one of them, doesn't affect the fact that there are lots of truths out there. And
right, but it definitely does affect the way that science is. See, this is also why the postmodern critics have been so effective in what they've done. It's because they're pushing the notion that a narrative necessarily drives the process of inquiry, even in relationship to objective facts. And I think that's true. And that's partly what we're discussing. Okay. Now, I also think, and I don't know how to reconcile these things, like the fact that you're making a case for the existence of the objective fact. It's like, I'm not going to argue about that. You're making a case for the existence of the objective fact. It's like, I'm not going to argue about that.
I care first and foremost about scientific truth. And so to me, it is a scientific question whether there is a supernatural power, creative power, intelligence in the universe. I think that's a very fascinating question. I think that if that were true, it would be the most important scientific truth if there is. It would be a fundamentally different kind of universe that we live in if there is a creative intelligence. So although I have a secondary interest in negative consequences of religion and so on, especially in Islam, my fundamental interest is in the scientific truth, which I believe is a scientific question, even if it can't be answered by scientific means. There either is a God or there isn't, and that there either is a creator or not at the base of the universe, an intelligence. I think there's not. I think that intelligence is something that comes late into the universe as a consequence of a long evolutionary process. It happened here, it no doubt happened, or probably happened in other parts of the universe.
Dawkins was asked in an interview some time later about what he thought of his chat with Jordan Peterson.
When he talks about religion, I think it's bullshit. I think that he doesn't make any sense at all. I think he's impressing people by using language they don't understand, rather like Deepak Chopra, where people think, oh, it must be terribly profound because I can't understand it, which is not something I can respect. Michael Shermer told me that he tried to pin him down and said, do you actually believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? And Jordan Peterson said, it would take me at least 2 days to answer that. So Michael said more or less, well, how about one sentence or one word? No. And that's how I feel about that. All the stuff about Jungian archetypes, and not that I would be skeptical about that, but constantly dragging them in. I mean, I think the most egregious example of that is where he looks at works of primitive art, works of tribal art, where he shows things like two snakes coiling around each other and says, well, they must have had some primitive, primeval knowledge of DNA. Perhaps they looked into their own cells in some sense and saw the DNA. Perhaps the DNA is, the double helix is a Jungian archetype. I mean, that is sheer bullshit, and I told him so.